Welcome to the Action Network podcast presented by FanDuel. We're back with our 5th annual edition of the Expert's Guide to Fantasy Football. I'm your host, Maria Marino, excited to be joined by Action Network fantasy experts, Sean Kerner and Chris Raybon. You can hear them every week during the NFL season on this very podcast, as well as the Fantasy Flex. Fellas, how we feeling today?
Feeling good, Maria. I'm just disappointed you didn't introduce us as the best performers coming off a bender in our company.
Gambly winning podcasters.
Exactly.
Okay. Quick backstory just for anyone listening. We had the awards, the Gamblies, our first annual edition. And that was an actual award that these two received, best performance off a bender. Congratulations, guys.
Thank you. Took a lot of hard work, but
that is only one of their many accomplishments. So a lot of listeners of this podcast probably know you guys already. And before we get into just best practices for fantasy football, this is how I've been informed to summarize their expertise. So every season, the website Fantasy Pros ranks the accuracy of almost 200 professional fantasy experts. And Chris and Sean consistently rank highly in these objective rankings. Last season, Chris and Sean both finished in the top 5. Clapping for you. Well done, guys.
Thank you.
So basically, you guys are qualified to talk about fantasy football. So that's why we have you on here to do just that. And obviously, you can't play fantasy football without a draft. So we're going to spend a lot of time talking about draft strategy and how to approach a draft. And it's perfect timing because a lot of these fantasy drafts are coming up very soon here as we get into August. So, this NFL offseason, there's been a lot of talk about running backs and sort of the position in the league being somewhat devalued by owners. And there's been a lot of contract disputes and whatnot. Despite how the actual NFL views running backs, it's my impression that in fantasy football, running backs are still extremely valuable and important. So Chris, why don't we start with you? Talk about your philosophy with running backs, and has it changed at all over the years? Because I think that the typical assumption is what I said, that running backs are where you want to focus things first.
Yeah, I think it has changed over the years. So maybe, 5-10 years ago, even you would look at running backs and they would almost exclusively be your first round, maybe even your second round picks. You'd always want to get an elite running back. But with the way the league is trending toward a passing league, not just the devaluing of running backs, but more just trending toward a passing league, there's less of the traditional bell cow running backs that we used to see, 10, 15 years ago. And so what's happened is there's usually a big tier break between the few elite running backs, think your Christian McCaffreys and your Austin Ecklers and everyone else, because most running backs just aren't getting those type of snap rates anymore. Derrick Henry's another one. But when you look at the overall way that, fantasy is being scored, like you have to start a whole team. Nowadays, you're usually starting a flex in addition to 2 running backs and at least 2 receivers. So wide receivers have become like more important, in my opinion, than running backs now. And so this year in particular, there's been a strategy that's kind of been kind of a trending up and down over the last few years called the 0 RB strategy, which is essentially where you don't really draft many running backs in the high leverage round, sometimes none. And I think this year, 2023 in particular, that actually works quite well because the difference between running backs and receivers is you're not going to find a team's number 1 receiver on the waiver wire. If a receiver gets hurt, the number 2 will go up to the number 1 and so on. Whereas running backs, you can find some of those guys due to injury, on the waiver wire or later in the draft. So I think it's really important to get, 3 bona fide receivers, plan to play a receiver in the flex. And especially this year, a lot of the RB2 types, the Miles Sanderses and the Aaron Joneses and the Cam Akers, there's a pretty kind of big tier of those guys, whereas the tier drops off a lot more after, the top 25 or 30 wide receivers. So my plan for this year in particular usually is to get, probably like 3 or 4 of those RB2 types. And if it means I miss out on a guy like McCaffrey, but I have, an extra elite wide receiver, I'm fine with that.
Interesting. So Sean, I know you have a few different strategies when it comes to running backs, including, this zero RB approach that that Raybon mentioned, which surprised me a little bit, but can you sort of lay those out and maybe what your preference is for this offseason?
Yeah, so there's really three main draft strategies when it comes to running backs, and they all focus on like the first 5 rounds. So the first is, Raybon mentioned it, zero running back, and it basically sums itself up. You take zero running backs in the first 5 rounds, so you're filling out your wide receivers. Maybe you take a quarterback, a tight end, but you're basically avoiding all running backs in the first 5 rounds. The second is robust running back, and that's where you take around 3 running backs in the first 5 rounds. You're just really loading up, maybe because everybody else is fading running backs. And the third is kind of a blend of the two. It's called hero running back. And that's where you take 1 running back, let's say in rounds 1 and 2, you just get a stud running back. And then you use the other 4 rounds to load up at wide receiver, take a quarterback or tight end. I'm typically of the hero running back mindset. I don't think, while I get the logic behind zero running back, I don't think you really want to avoid it. It's still very important. It's very fragile. Running backs are constantly getting injured. It's, they're smaller frame. They're taking the most hits. It's a very violent position. So I get the fragility of it, but you still want to have a good running back. So I like taking a running back this season. Probably round 2 is when I'm taking a running back. And then I'm with Raybon. Like, you want to load up in receivers. If you have an elite quarterback fall to you, great. You can take him this year. If you have the opportunity to get a Travis Kelce or a Mark Andrews, you could do that. But I do think you want to come with the first 5 rounds with a running back in the first couple, let's say. So I can get behind the hero RB approach. And then I'm using the middle to late rounds to really fill out my bench with a lot of high upside running backs, because that kind of takes advantage of the fragility and volatility of the position. So I think the hero running back approach is sort of the best of both worlds.
And to add to what Sean is saying about the fragility of the position, so to put some numbers behind it, when you look at running backs typically drafted in a 12-team league, they're usually, the median missed games for a running back is usually going to be 2 to 3 games. Whereas for other positions, it's usually going to be 1 game, maybe 2 games, certain years. But running backs tend to miss usually double the games of other positions. And if you look at the averages, even more, because you'll have some of those, longer injuries or IR stints or season enders. So that's why we're kind of talking about the fragility of the position. And the more snaps, the more likely a guy is to get hurt, which is why, some of those, like those robust running back strategies where you're taking, 2 or 3 or 4 in the first 5 rounds, that can bite you in the back because, you're taking these guys that are going to be projected to be bell cows, but they're also more likely to get hurt. And you're not really balancing your team with, high upside, high floor, high ceiling guys at other positions that are less likely to get hurt. So you end up reducing the amount of startable games that you have across your entire lineup over the course of the season.
Well, I have to say, I've always been more of a play it safe kind of fantasy football participant. So, I mean, to me, the zero RB, like, I'm scared. I'm too scared. I think I definitely traditionally have leaned with the hero running back approach where, my first round pick or my first round pick might be a wide receiver, but I'm definitely taking a running back in that second round then. But it sounds like both of you, you're going wide receiver with your first pick in the draft.
More often than not, but a big thing we should also mention early on in the podcast is I think Sean and I would both agree very strongly that you should not have a rigid draft strategy coming in. So we're just trying to coin, and these names have been coined, but just trying to coin these strategy names for people to differentiate between the different potential strategies. But this is also something that it's going to depend on the year. It's going to depend on the draft and who's available, because, just because I kind of skew wide receiver early on doesn't mean I don't have any running backs ranked in my top 12 or top 24 or whatever. So it really just depends on the year. And I think that's a big piece of advice. Do not have a rigid strategy because you want to kind of understand where the value is by default and, according to the consensus ADP, but then you can react to when things go sideways and not as expected.
Right. So, I mean, you have your plan going in, your plan A, but you also have to react and adapt to what's happening in real time, what's unfolding, and to your point, who is available. So what are some other important rules when it comes to draft strategy, Sean?
So one of my favorite things to do is if it's not required, I don't even draft a kicker or defense. Those are positions that you could just stream in season and be fine with that. So instead of drafting kicker or defense, I like to stash 2 more backup running backs in the last rounds and just hold on to them before the season starts. And sometimes you can get lucky. I remember I took James Conner with my last pick in almost every league, and that was the year that Le'Veon Bell held out into the season.
Wow.
And James Conner ended up being a league winner. So it's like, what would be better, having a potential league winner there or having Mason Crosby just rotting away on your bench? So I always advise people to hang on to 2 extra running backs. And then by week 1, if none of them hit, which is probably the most likely outcome, then you could drop them, pick up a kicker defense. But for when it comes to quarterbacks, another strategy that I have is, ideally I want to get a top 7 quarterback, especially this year. But if I can't, it's totally fine to not even draft a quarterback if you don't want to, because that's another position where during the season, if you're in, say, a 12-team league that only starts 1 quarterback, you're able to stream, potentially a top 12 quarterback every week just based on matchups. And sometimes you could stumble upon a guy that you're going to be using every week. Like last year, Geno Smith was a perfect example. Justin Herbert, his rookie season, I ended up with him on a few teams, and I didn't even draft the quarterback that year. So you can get lucky with that. However, if you're in a league that starts 2 quarterbacks or is a super flex league, it's the exact opposite. You want to get 2 to 3 quarterbacks as early as possible because, again, at any given time, there's only 32 starting quarterbacks. There's a huge drop off between QB 32 and QB 33. Whereas other positions, even if a guy's backing somebody up, they're still going to get stats and provide value. But that's just not a luxury you have with quarterbacks. So in leagues where you start 2 quarterbacks, it's a much different strategy where you have to draft them much earlier.
Well, I'm curious, Sean, because you said especially this year to pick up, a top 7 quarterback. Can you just explain why?
Yeah, in years past, what I call the streaming tier, quarterbacks, say 12 through 24, there's been a lot of good quarterbacks that I would be happily, streaming throughout the season. Whereas we didn't have as many elite quarterbacks like we do now. So right now we have guys like Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson, Joe Burrow, Justin Herbert, Justin Fields, really good quarterbacks that are going to be ranked in the top 5 most weeks. So that gives you a huge advantage by having one of them. Whereas the streaming tier have a lot of question marks, and I'm not as comfortable this year. So that's why I'm saying this is a year where I'm more comfortable taking a quarterback early.
Gotcha. And you also, of course, talked about just, streaming defenses and kickers, not even worrying about drafting them. I can tell you from my experience, sometimes I would feel like that peer pressure where there'd be that person in the league that way too early, drafts a defense and you're like, whoa, should I be looking at defense? You got to resist the temptation to just keep your eyes on your own paper. But Raybon, I was curious if you had any other just general strategies that you wanted to throw into this before we move on.
Yeah, so I think the big one is you cannot win your draft in the first few rounds, but you can lose it. So the earlier you are in the draft, the more you want to make sure you're taking players with as little risk as possible, with as high a floor as possible. And that's why I think, we've started to, go towards wide receivers more, just simply due to the missed games. If you have a running back and a wide receiver, for example, projected for the same amount of points per game, just know that running back is likely to miss more games. So sometimes you can mitigate risk by going with a hero running back strategy, like Sean mentioned, or a 0 running back strategy. So that's the first thing. As you get further into the draft, that's where you want to take more and more risks, because once you get, into the double-digit rounds, you want upside. You already drafted players that should be, generally safe for your starting lineup and that are going to get consistent playing time. But once you get into those double-digit rounds, now you don't really need as many high floor guys as you're looking for. A high ceiling guy that maybe can either, replace a starter that you already have and make your team even better, or be a trade chip or whatever. Not, you need those high ceiling guys that you can see putting up startable numbers, not just the best RB5 or RB4 or wide receiver 4 over the course of the season. Like you want guys who can be, RB1s or wide receiver 1 or 2. So that's a big thing. And then just my philosophy is I'm always looking for startable games. So for each position, it's how can I get to the amount of startable games that I need for my entire lineup. So, you have to factor in the flex there. And that's why, a lot of times you can wait on quarterback because there are, if you're starting one, there's still going to be a lot of startable games available on the waiver wire later in the draft. That's why you can stream a position like that. Same thing for kicker or defense. So I would always take those positions last if I was forced to. And if not, I would follow the strategy Sean mentioned where you don't even draft them and you just stash extra backs and receivers. But safety early, upside late. That's the general principle.
Got it. And, since you talked about floor and ceiling, these are terms that we hear all the time. And, high floor, I take that to mean sort of low risk, like you were saying. And then, ceiling is like they have high upside.
Yeah.
But since we're on that topic, Sean, do you want to maybe just briefly define those terms a little more specifically and also volatility?
Yeah, so we have to think about every player as having a range of outcomes for what their final stat line will be. So when we refer to someone's ceiling, we're essentially referring to their best case scenario in their range of outcomes. So for example, let's take rookie running back Zach Charbonnet for the Seahawks, for example. So he's going to be backing up Kenneth Walker this season. He's probably going to finish in the RB 35 range if both running backs are healthy all season. However, if Kenneth Walker suffers a season-ending injury before week 1, let's say, Zach Charbonnet could end up being a top 10 running back this year. So we would refer to that as his ceiling, something that is in his range of outcomes, but might not be likely. But again, that's in his range of outcomes. So when we're saying he has a high ceiling, that's kind of what I'm referring to. And, when it comes to where to draft players like that, I think Raybon mentioned it. It's a little bit later in the draft. It's guys that are backups. You can get them cheaper. They have a lot of upside, but they need things to go their way to hit there. That's kind of when you're drafting based on ceiling. However, when it comes early in the draft, like Raybon mentioned, that's where you can kind of lose it. So you're wanting to draft guys with the high floor. So when it comes to floor, I guess we could say everyone has the same floor, which is getting hurt before week 1 and missing the entire season, getting 0 points. Unfortunately, that's part of the game. So when it comes to floor, we're just assuming everybody's healthy. What's the worst case scenario if everyone's healthy? And a player like Keenan Allen comes to mind as somebody that has a really high floor. If he's healthy and plays the whole season, you could write him in for 100 catches, 1,100 yards, and 6 to 7 touchdowns. Like he's a guarantee to put up those type of numbers, but he doesn't have like a massive ceiling of like 15 plus touchdowns. So I would say he's a low volatile player. Like he has a narrow range of outcomes, which early in the draft is fantastic. That's what you want. Whereas somebody like Kadarius Toney, who's always getting hurt, has a random big game here or there, he's highly volatile. So you have to kind of know when to draft players like that and kind of understand what we mean by saying a guy has a high ceiling or a high floor. And at certain points in the draft, one is more valuable than the other. So like I said, in the beginning of the draft, you kind of want to go for a high floor. Whereas later on, that's where you want to take your shots and take guys with a high ceiling.
Raybon, anything you want to add to that, just as far as sort of how you assess those two things and also just like how you measure volatility?
Yeah. So when you're looking at, again, I like to look at startable games and kind of look at, a lot of sites track like, how many top 10 finishes or top 5 finishes. You can kind of think of it like that. Like how many of those throughout the season is a player capable of putting up, max and minimum. So when you look at, I think the best way to explain the difference between like a high floor and a high ceiling pick later in the draft is, look at like the Seattle situation, for example. If you were choosing between, like DJ Dallas is a guy who, because I think Charbonnet and Kenneth Walker are actually hurt right now. So if you look at a guy like DJ Dallas, like he might only be the third down back, even if those guys are hurt. Whereas maybe a guy like Kenny McIntosh And these are just examples, but maybe he might be a 3-down back. So you would take the 3-down back, even if DJ Dallas might, his median projection, because you're still projecting Walker and Charbonnet to play, might be higher. So it's things like that. It's like, who would be the 3-down back? Like you don't want a receiver to come in and just be like still the third option in the slot. Like maybe, if a guy like Donovan Peoples-Jones gets hurt, you'd look at a guy like Cedric Tillman, who would be his direct backup to come in and potentially get those deep targets, versus, Elijah Moore, his role might not change as much. So you're just kind of looking for those discrepancies later on in the draft, because I think as you go down ADP, especially once you get outside the starters, maybe the top 50, I don't think anyone really knows what to do. And I think that's where a lot of times people like, Sean and myself excel, is like there's just these late round picks. Like I remember you could get Isaiah Pacheco pretty late in drafts last year. And that was the guy that, we said, okay, at some point in the year, he's going to get the starting role. So that would be an example of a guy, and I know Jerick McKinnon had a good season as well, but usually you would take a guy like Pacheco, who you could see starting over a guy like McKinnon, who's usually going to top out as that third down, passing down specialist kind of back. So that's the difference between high ceiling and high floor later in the draft. And you can, when you're measuring these things, you can look at something like just the standard deviation in fantasy points, or each stat. Like, the standard deviation for wide receiver receiving yards game to game is going to be, higher than rushing yards or passing yards as a percentage of the stat. So things like that you can use to measure as well.
So obviously, in those later rounds, when you're looking to find some of those higher ceiling players that, could potentially break out, especially later in the year, that's oftentimes going to be filling your flex position. And Raybon, I know you sort of mentioned flex before, but Sean, was there anything else that you wanted to highlight just regarding how to treat the flex position during drafts?
The flex position isn't really something that's like a draft strategy. Again, you're going to be using either a running back or wide receiver for the flex.
Right.
So, my draft strategy of just loading up at running backs as much as possible,
Right.
and then taking receivers with high upside will just sort itself out. So during the season, I'm going to just be playing whichever one has the highest projection that week. And of course, you can make that decision by looking at our rankings week to week, but that's more of a week to week decision than something I'm attacking in the draft.
Makes sense. Well, let me ask you this, Sean, what is your preferred draft position? Not that you can necessarily control such things.
Right. It's outside of your control. So ideally you don't care. And I don't really care. I think wherever I end up, I'll be fine. I typically, you typically want one of the first 6 picks, because that's where you can get, the elite players, and then it starts to drop off a bit. So there is an edge of having a first 6 pick when it comes to the first round. But overall, in the grand scheme of the draft, I actually like being in the middle, because one of my draft strategies is trying to figure out which players will make it back to me. And if you're in the middle of the draft, at any given time, you're roughly thinking, okay, there's going to be 12 players drafted before my next pick. So it's a little bit easier to be in control of, which players you take when. Whereas if you're at the beginning or end of the draft, you usually have to account for 22 or 23 players that'll get taken before your next pick. So you kind of have to make reaches a little bit. You're less sure that certain players will make it back. So being in the middle, I feel like I have more control, and I'm able to get the specific players I want. Where if I'm at the end, I'm more at the mercy of the rest of the league. So that's why I prefer the middle of the draft for the later rounds.
I also have found, like, with a snake draft, if you're a little too close to the turn, like sometimes, like, I know what I want to do with my next pick, and then all of a sudden my other pick is coming up so fast. I'm like, wait, I didn't get a chance to decide yet.
Right.
So hold on. I actually have another question. And this is really just my own curiosity. What is your preferred league size for both of you? Like, how many teams?
I prefer 12. I prefer 12. I just think that's kind of been the classic. 10 is fun, but it just feels a little less challenging, because there's like the player pool is a little bit bigger for the teams available, I guess you could say. So I prefer 12.
Yeah, Sean? I mean, I prefer 12 too, but to be honest, like, it'd be super fun to be in a 32 team league. Right, Raybon, we're
Yeah.
deciding if Kyle Juszczyk is in play this week. Like, expand the
CJ
player
Ham.
pool. The
Yes.
more players that are involved, the more I'm gonna like it. So give me a 32 team league. But other than that, like the traditional 12 teamer is fine with me.
I have found that 14 is pretty fun. Just
Yeah.
saying.
Right.
14, it's like a little extra challenge. No, it is.
It is,
Yeah.
but so oddly, this is a little background of me that neither of you asked for, but I was in a league for years, actually at my former employer, SiriusXM, where I believe you both have done work as well in the past, but the league there was always 16 teams, always. And it was so rough. And like the waiver wire was so thin every
Sounds
year.
fun.
I finished third back to back. So I was very proud of that. But anyway, so, and I assume that you guys prefer PPR.
Or half or full. Because
I actually
sometimes,
like half too.
Yeah, because sometimes full, and I know a lot of people play full, and there's not usually a massive difference, especially in the projections. But the thing about it is, just from a practical standpoint, if a guy catches like 6 passes for 4 yards, like you'd rather not reward him as much. So I do prefer half. I think it's a good mix between not rewarding it at all and not like over rewarding volume.
Exactly.
I agree. I also prefer the half point. And I'll just say that league that I mentioned, not only was it 16 teams, it was standard. It was brutal. But
start one quarterback. Only start one quarterback.
Yes. Yes. So anyways, let's talk about some other things that you guys have mentioned. Obviously, rankings are something that you guys do with regularity. And then also ADP is a term that, Raybon, I heard you mention, average draft position. So what are the best ways to sort of utilize those two things, Raybon?
So the thing I think people have to know is that rankings aren't necessarily where you should take a player. You also have to take into account ADP. So let's say I have a running back ranked 10th among running backs. He's the RB10, but his ADP is not to RB25. If there were 9 other running backs off the board and then you just took him as the 10th running back, you wouldn't be getting good value because you could have probably waited for another 10 to 12 running backs to go off the board, and my RB10 would have still been on the board. So you want to use average draft position along with rankings to make your decision. You want it because remember, average draft position is just an average. There's always going to be times when that doesn't go according to plan either. So it's just more of being able, like you mentioned, Maria, you have to kind of plan your picks out during the draft as they happen and kind of react to what's going on the board. So I think that's the thing with rankings. It's the rankings are, how are you valuing players with, but within positions and then between positions, but then you have to use ADP for that final to determine where exactly you're going to end up drafting these players. That's the final thing. Like if you just have rankings and no idea of ADP, you're still probably not going to have the perfect draft because you're going to leave value on the table, even if you take guys in the order that we're projecting them to finish. That's still not going to be enough because you could get even more value by paying attention to ADP and taking guys, just around where they're going to fall a little ahead of it if you're really targeting them.
Okay, so both, not one or the other. Sean, what else?
Yeah, so just piggybacking what Raybon said, I think your main goal is to take the best available player based on position need that is unlikely to make it back to you. That's kind of how you escape these traps. So the biggest mistake I see people make using my rankings is they just draft them to a T. And that's how you kill value. Like if you take a guy 2 to 3 rounds before he would have been selected, you're kind of killing that value. So if a guy's going to make it back to you, don't draft them, draft the best available player that won't make it back to you. So having a good understanding of where people are being drafted, like through ADP, you get that through practice. And also ADP changes itself. Like today, an example would be Tim Patrick looks like he suffered a potentially season-ending injury. So if you look at a guy like Marvin Mims, ADP, it's going to be like wide receiver 70. But if you were to hop in a draft right now, he might go like wide receiver 55 or something like that. So you just have to be understanding of like where ADPs might currently be or where they might go. So that's half of the draft battle is trying to guess when and where people go. But the reason you need to do that is because you need to maximize, our rankings and getting guys before they're taken off the board, not, like 2 or 3 rounds before. That's how you kill, the value. So being aware of current ADP trends, I think is huge.
Well, of course, by doing all of this stuff that you guys have already discussed, hopefully you're going to have a quote unquote good draft. I mean, I know draft grades are given out immediately after, and I'm not really sure how accurate those are because obviously so much can change throughout the year. But is there anything else that you recommend, Raybon, to just sort of mitigate having a bust in the draft or just bad picks?
Yeah, I think, well, the first thing, don't pay attention to those post-draft grades.
Yeah.
They're kind of algorithm based and they're never going to fully capture that. Maybe one day they will be able to, but I haven't seen any yet that have captured kind of the nuances of team building.
They hate my teams because I don't have a kicker or defense. Too, so.
Exactly.
They're
But I think, yeah. So to avoid bust, it differs by positions. I think there's always things, you can look out for each position. With running backs, it's, age is something where, the older a running back gets, especially once you get past, 27, 28, I think injuries are more likely and just decline is more likely. Wide receivers, you always want to kind of look at the quarterback involved. And also, if it's a team where you're just kind of assuming a guy's going to be the number one, but there's, a lot of newer players or rookies or second year guys on the team. Remember, those guys tend to take jumps. So that could kind of, there could be some risk there with those guys. And then I think on the opposite side, also pay attention to certain trends within positions. Like wide receivers tend to break out in their second or third year. They tend to take a big leap. So that's something you usually want to factor in. Rookie running backs tend to, be productive right away. And a lot of times you can, the uncertainty is where you're going to get those edges. So where are things different from last year? Because anyone can look at, some stats from last year, kind of say, okay, well, that's roughly what this player is going to do this year. But I think it's a lot harder for people to accurately project rookies or project the improvements that a, second year player might make or the drop-offs that some of, the older veterans might have. So that's a lot of times where you can find value, stocking up on second year receivers, third year receivers, stocking up on rookie running backs, even if going into week one, it doesn't necessarily look like they have, a path to like a startable value in week one. Sean does his running back upside rankings where he actually looks at, how would this running back perform if the starter got hurt? And that's how you got to kind of think about it. So I think rookie running backs, second and third year receivers, those are some things you can do to kind of get upside and then just avoiding, bad situations, teams, offensive line issues could be an issue for certain running backs or even certain receivers if a quarterback isn't going to have enough time to throw down the field. So paying attention to things like that is going to be crucial. And then for tight ends, you're always looking for routes run. So if a tight end doesn't look like he's going to play, the majority of the snaps, like a guy like a Mike Gesicki last year, where it was like, okay, is he going to be out there when they need a blocker? No, and then that kind of tanked his value. So I'm just kind of being aware of those kind of things. It's very player specific. I think one of the things in fantasy you don't want to do is overgeneralize. Like there are some broader trends and things to look out for, but then you still have to go and say, okay, does this actually apply now to this player or not? It's just a starting point. So that's where guys like Sean and I come in, listen to our podcast, our tweets and things like that. So yeah.
Sean, thoughts on draft busts?
Yeah, I mean, busts happen. I make mistakes all the time. We're ending up with a handful of busts on my team. They're just going to bust or get hurt. Most of the time, it's out of your control. So that's why I do things like draft a ton of running backs late in the draft and stash them on my bench. It's sort of insurance for that. Like we've said off the top, it's a position that can have a lot of injuries, volatility, where guys, leapfrog the starter because they're struggling. So there's a lot of things that can go wrong with running back. And I would say to be especially careful with running backs in the rounds 3 through 6 range every season. This is commonly referred to as the dead zone. I prefer frozen pond. And I'm not saying you need to completely avoid it. Usually there's 1 or 2 backs in this range I love every year. Last year I targeted Tony Pollard heavily in this range. This is the range where you could have grabbed Josh Jacobs. So there are league winners in this range. So I try to key in on a couple players. If they fall to me, great. However, the way you get in trouble in this range is you just take a running back just because you think you need one. So that's sort of how people get in trouble in this range. So that's kind of one of the ways that I avoid getting bust, is avoiding running backs I'm lukewarm about in this range, just because they do bust at such a high rate based on all the reasons we've laid out for running backs. So that's basically my number one way of avoiding busts at running backs.
And just to add to that, we mentioned running backs tend to get hurt more. So paying attention to the preseason injuries as well, because just appearing on the injury report makes a player more likely to appear on the injury report in the future. And, like there's about 25 to 30% of players who are questionable tend to miss a game. If you miss one, the average, if you miss one game, the likelihood is you're usually missing more than one game. So a lot of times I think I notice every year guys are usually overvalued that are hurt. Like J.K. Dobbins comes to mind last year. This year, Breece Hall and Javonte Williams are guys I think we have to be very careful with. And then you look at a guy like Jamison Williams, who, Sean and I both think is just egregiously overvalued. I think he's going in the top 50 receivers. He's going to miss 6 games. And this is not even an injury risk. Like, we know he's going to miss 6 games. So like when you factor that out, yes, like you can play another player, while he's out. But again, it's limiting your max upside, because the ideal situation would be to draft a guy with with that pick that could potentially give you 17 games of upside, or 13, or more than 10 or 11, So I think injuries and missed games are something that, just at having an understanding of, first of all, that running backs are going to be twice as likely, and second of all, that guys that start the year and that are already hurt, they tend to be overvalued, because people tend to kind of brush it off, and the average fantasy drafter is not necessarily paying attention to every beat report and every piece of news and updating the way we are. So it's like, to us, it's like, Jesus, this guy's been hurt for like the entire camp. But like to somebody else, it's like, okay, he was good last year. He's questionable for week 1, but like so is every football player, right? Like,
right.
It's football. So like, but like really pay attention to those injuries, and especially like what kind of injuries, because it sounds like a cliche, but soft tissue injuries linger. If it's a guy like a note for Tua Tagovailoa, for example, if he gets a concussion, he's probably missing multiple weeks, if not more, just if he gets a concussion, period, which would be different from a lot of players. So, just kind of knowing things like that, and making sure that as you're drafting, you have the most information possible, and you're not necessarily stepping into some of those risks when you could avoid, unless it's an appropriate risk. Like I said, if it's the 12th round, sure, take a chance on an injured guy is a lot better. But especially in those first 5, 6, 7 rounds, that's where you're really going to go wrong. And a lot of times those running backs, those 3 to 6 running backs don't work out as much, because again, they get hurt more. And then what happens? Those running backs in round 7 through 12, those are the guys that are going to be taking their place. So that's kind of why that's kind of how you have to look at it when it comes to bust. Just kind of look at those missed game risks for each player.
And this is why you have to follow our fantasy experts. We're talking with Chris Raybon and Sean Kerner here on the Action Network podcast, because you guys do put so much work in to your projections, to your rankings, and you're doing all of that research that, the average listener of this show, like, probably doesn't have time to do. So with that in mind, Sean, what is your process for just researching and doing prep leading up to a draft?
Well, for me personally, I'm creating projections and updating them constantly. So I have that edge going with me, but I think something that everybody should do, including myself, is to just do as many mock drafts as possible, or take actual best ball teams, because you're going to be in drafts with people competing for money. So that's been the best way that I prepare for the season, is just draft as many best ball teams as possible, because as always, practice makes perfect. So by doing a ton of drafts, you kind of know where your weaknesses are. Like, so my first initial drafts, I'm like stumped. Like I know what part of the draft, and I'm like, I don't know what the hell to do. So I go back, I come up with a plan. So it's one of those things where you get a sense of how other people are drafting, where your, weak spots might be, and you just kind of get a better overall plan by just doing a lot of drafts. So that's my advice. If you don't want to like pony up money and do real best ball drafts, just do mock drafts on any of the sites, and you're going to get better and have a better understanding on like what your overall strategy should be.
Raybon, you agree?
Yeah, absolutely. Getting, whether it's, you could do a draft simulator, you could do, I prefer best ball drafts because I like to have some skin on each draft. Like
Yeah.
I'm past the point where if I'm going to spend like, an hour on a draft, I need to have some upside there, but that's just me.
Yes. Yeah.
But to a larger point, I think it's just understanding, kind of the tiers going in, and Sean,
Yeah.
during the week does tier, divides players into tiers at each position, just understanding the drop offs, because there'll be certain tiers that you want to take as many players as possible, and there'll be some tiers where you want to take like a player as close to the bottom as possible. Like you don't want to start a tier and like you're probably getting the worst value there. So just kind of understanding that, I think is big. And there's always going to be, like there's a few players that just kind of stand out. Like I would never say do not draft, because I think there's a point at a draft where everyone becomes valuable, but there's certain players that you could see like they're probably not ever going to get to be as valuable as you think they are based on their ADP. So like guys like Jamison Williams, for me, like he's a guy I know I'm not going to draft. So just kind of having an idea of guys that you really think are well overvalued, guys that, kind of targets that you think are generally going to be undervalued, and kind of building your team around that. And like, you mentioned, Maria, that like some certain strategies, like maybe a zero RB, it's kind of scary. So that's why, that's where these like mock drafts or best balls come in, because that's why I say like, hey, like this year's a little different for me. I am kind of drafting running backs later on average, because I've looked at my teams and compared them, when I take, 2 running backs in the first 4 or 5 rounds to teams where I take 1 or none even. And I'm like, I feel a lot better about this team. And that's something where you can always post your teams online to get feedback from us or the community or whoever. So I think it is important to kind of go through your draft in some type of way, and kind of see how your team would look from different draft spots. Or if your draft spot, you could just do that one. But yeah, that preparation is key, because there's nothing that's going to replace knowing how your team, or getting examples of how your team is actually going to look at the end.
I confess that I haven't done a lot of mock drafting in my fantasy career, and that's probably why I have faced some of this, draft day anxiety that I discussed. But look, there's so much that happens. I mean, the draft is one thing, but in-season management is maybe even more important, because that's a week to week and it's a constant thing. So, all right, you get through the draft. It's time to set the lineups. How do you do that, Sean? And how do game scripts play into it?
So again, I'm basing most of my decisions based on the projections I'm making. And one of the when it comes to game scripts, that is an important part when it comes to Raybon or my projections, because players' roles can change based on game script. So just when it comes to like running back, for example, let's look at week 1. The Lions are 6.5 point underdogs facing the Chiefs on the road. So when it comes to, Jahmyr Gibbs, a pass catching back, versus Dave Montgomery, who's probably going to be more of the early down back, that's a game where there's going to be more passing volume, and a player like Gibbs is probably going to be more involved, while Montgomery less so. And on the flip side, you have the Commanders, who are a 6 point home favorite. They're not going to be big favorites very often during the season, but they will week 1 against Cardinals. So Brian Robinson for the Commanders is typically going to thrive in a more, positive game script like that. So he's probably going to be more in play than the rest of the season. Whereas Antonio Gibson, their pass catching back, will probably get a downgrade. And I'm not saying you should start or sit any of these guys, but game scripts do have a pretty big influence when it comes to a player's projection, because it does dictate, if a team's going to be more likely to throw more or run more. So that's a big part when it comes to making projections and rankings.
Raybon, what about you? How do you go about setting your lineups, or what's the biggest thing that goes into it?
So I think, game scripts are very important, and that, from a like the way we're doing projections is, at least the way I do them, is I'm usually I have like a baseline for every player, what he would do against like a league average opponent. Same thing for teams. How often would they pass and run versus a league average defense? And then, for each week I'll go and I'll have like my projected spread. For example, if a team is a 10 point favorite they're going to pass less than they would against, the average team, which you would be a pick 'em or something. So, kind of looking at it like that, but it's all going to come down to rankings. And like, that's, what Sean and I are doing. So, it's really like all that is going to be kind of accounted for. But yes, I think when it comes to game scripts, they're very helpful just to know some general things. Quarterbacks, for example, highly correlated to a team's implied point total. So that means like if a team is a 10-point favorite with an over under of 50, that means they're projected to score 30 points or whatever. So like that's a really good score. So the more implied points, generally the higher a quarterback's going to score. Same thing goes for defense, for kickers, and then for defenses it's the opposite. It's the lower the implied points for the opponent, the better you are with defenses. So I think looking at things like the Vegas lines, or if you happen to be doing your own game projections, which I'm sure certain people do, yeah. or you just maybe you look at like 538 or one of those other models, whatever you do, like those can help with those kind of onesie positions. And then if you're looking, there's also the other thing to think about when you're setting a lineup, and this can happen I think a lot more late in the year when you're kind of posturing for playoff position. But if you're in a situation where you feel like you're an underdog in your lineup, then you may want to take put a more riskier player in your lineup. That goes back to, like, for example, I'm trying to think of like who's like your average slot receiver these days who like doesn't, like Isaiah McKenzie. Oh yeah, that's perfect actually. Tyler Boyd, there we go. Yeah, because Isaiah McKenzie might not even win that job. But yeah, Tyler Boyd is a perfect example. Tyler Boyd, you know what he's gonna do most weeks? He's gonna get 2 to 4 catches for like 30 to 50 yards, probably. Maybe a touchdown every 2 or 3 games. Whereas you may have let's say a rookie, like let's say Michael Wilson is starting, is like he's the starter for the Cardinals, and you're like, okay, like, Marquise Brown is banged up. This guy might, kind of bust out here. He might give me a higher ceiling, or just like a DJ Chark, a guy who's going to get more deep balls thrown to him. So you might want to start him if you're an underdog. If you're a favorite, you just need those 3 to 5, those 3 to 5 catches. Then you start a guy like Tyler Boyd. So that's the other consideration. And if you're ahead on Monday night, and you don't get a bonus for like scoring more points, when you're like ahead by only a few points, just you could take a guy out of your lineup too, because the last thing you want is a guy to like fumble, get hurt, get like minus 2.6, leave the game, and you lose by like 1/10 of a point because you left him in.
Nothing worse.
Yeah. So like thinking about things like that. And there's certain things you can also do, like if later in the year, attrition is going to play a big part. And if you see your opponent is weak at running back, and it probably has to pick up somebody barring the injury report, if you have the space on your roster and you're not really using like maybe the last 1 or 2 spots because your team's in good shape, you can drop, like maybe you have like a 6th wide receiver. You could drop that 6th wide receiver and try to pick up, a running back that then your opponent won't be able to pick up. So there are things like that. And of course, if you have a waiver claim, you might not want to waste it. But so it depends on, the type of free agency your league has. But things like that, you can pay attention to get a little bit of an edge as well.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned waivers. We're going to get into that in just a second. But I think, like, as you were describing that, I was just having flashbacks. I feel like most, fantasy casual players have been in that situation where the obvious play is to start your stud, but like a potential game script or some other factor is telling you like maybe this other player that you wouldn't usually start, it might be riskier, like might be the better play. And that's like the internal debate. And like, you're looking for that, like, you're just looking for that decision. Like, do I go this way or that way? So I think that's probably one of the biggest challenges on a week to week basis. And then the other thing is the commitment to, paying attention to the waiver wire, and also sort of playing a little defense, like you were talking about, Raybon, within your league, paying attention to other people's rosters, identifying needs that you might have and where you could maybe find some leverage and potentially trade with people. I was like, I've in my career been like pretty anti-trade. Trades like freak me out, especially when somebody offers me one. I'm like, whoa, what's the catch here? So I'm very defensive when it comes to trades. So, Sean, can you relate?
Yeah. So a lot of my leagues, no one trades with me. Like my buddy's league, they don't. They think I'm trying to, siphon off their best player or something. But trades in general are tough to rely on. It really depends on your league mates, and if they're willing to do that, if they're willing to go through with them. But if you're in a league that loves trading, it's a great way to sell high or buy low on players and just alter your roster based on what your current needs are. There's a million examples I could use when it comes to trades, but one I could think of is like, let's say you're 8-0, and it looks like you're destined for the playoffs. And your team building process should be looking towards the playoffs, like looking at players that maybe have good matchups in week 16 and 17 and maybe try to acquire them for cheap. Another example would be if a player like Saquon Barkley, let's say he suffers a multi-week injury where he's going to be out the next 3 games and then he should be fine for the fantasy playoffs. What I would do is try to get that player, especially if that's a team that's fighting to make the playoffs. They're 4-6 or whatever. They need to kind of sacrifice short-term value or to make the playoffs. So that's a trade that could be mutually beneficial for both people. So again, there's a million different ways to kind of deal with trades and what you should or shouldn't do, but it is a good way to kind of sell high or buy low or just build your team based on current needs.
Rayvon, do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think the usually the ideal trade is when you're trading away multiple players of lesser value for a stud. Usually that's the way you're going to put your team in the best position. If you drafted well, what you're going to hope that some of the players, because again, you want to be taking, higher ceiling, higher risk guys later in the draft. If a couple of those guys pan out and you weren't planning on them to be your starters anyway, a lot of times you can package, maybe, 2 wide receiver 3s and maybe a number 2 running back for like a stud wide receiver or a stud running back, because certain teams might be, as Sean mentioned, fighting for playoffs position and they're just decimated by injuries. They just need the bodies. So that's why it's always important to I usually don't like to hold more than 1 quarterback or tight end if you only have to start one on my roster, because you want to load up on running backs and wide receivers, because those are your trade chips, especially running backs. Like if you have 5 startable running backs, like you can control your entire league in terms of trading, because most people are going to have 1 to 2 if that. So I think that's really how the ideal is usually to package multiple lesser guys for a stud running back or a stud wide receiver that would be difficult to replace or acquire otherwise on the waiver wire once you've already drafted.
It's something important to look out for, because I always have felt like there's usually like that one person in the league that tries to like bait everybody else into like a bad trade and just will like offer so many trade scenarios. And you always have to like pause and like, am I really taking this seriously? But, I think I have seen that a lot where it's like, okay, it looks exciting because there's like 3 players for one. And then you like look and you're like, well, these players all suck. So like, why am I going to trade? This, so definitely something to look out for. And how about waivers, Sean? What are your thoughts on waivers?
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to waivers, it's really one of the key ways to really build a championship roster. And there's a few guys every year that end up being league winners that you could have scooped up on waivers. And when it comes to waivers, I think it's key to know when to burn your number 1 waiver or below your fab budget. Typically, I do this on a running back who presents, like multiple weeks of value for the rest of the season, as opposed to just a couple games. So, for example, if a backup running back who's going to be filling in for running back that's just going to be missing 1 or 2 games, I wouldn't go all in on that unless, they're must-win games where you need them to go to the playoffs. The times I go all in is when, starting running back gets a season-ending injury and now the backup is going to start the rest of the season, presumably. That's the time to go all in. Kind of goes back to what Raybon was talking about, startable games. You're going to get the most startable games from a back like that. So those are typically the situations that you really want to just like go all in, spend your number 1 waiver or your fab budget. But again, it depends based on the situation, but usually those are the situations that I like to go all in.
Yeah, I think.
And
Oh, sorry. I was just gonna say. I think with like first of all, running backs are by far the way to spend your fab budget. Like a lot of times, even if I need to pick up a tight end, a quarterback, something, I'll never use my waiver priority. I'll just let the rest of the week kind of bid on guys,
Right.
and then I'll just use like once everyone's free to just pick up. That's when I'll pick up those positions. So you kind of want to save most of your budget for running backs, and the later you get in the season, the more you can kind of adjust it. So I would say don't go, don't blow your budget early, because like even if there is a running back that looks great, like let's say a guy goes down in week 1, yes, there might be a running back coming in that now has a lot more value, but there also could be the possibility there's still a long time for that running back to get injured, because now you're still in week 2. So the further you get into the season, the more you can kind of go, you'll know when to go bigger on one specific back. But also if you have some budget left over for later, then you can start using it. Maybe there's a key matchup that you have to win, and there's like one defense that's just head over heels above every other defense you could pick up, and you're streaming. Maybe you do spend a couple dollars on that defense, because it'll make your team that much better. So I would say a key is also just don't look to like blow your budget early. If you start 0-1 or 0-2, it's not the end of the world. Trust the process, like, because if you start 0-2 and you eventually rebound, and now you're sitting at like 6-5 with no FAAB budget, you're going to be in a lot worse of a position than the alternative. So like if you draft a bad team, sometimes bad teams are just going to happen. There's nothing you can do to fix it. But like a FAAB is not like and waiver is not like a massive fix to, like, you need to kind of spread that out, because again, you need to be able to react to not only your own injuries, but if something else comes up in the league, maybe it's blocking another person. So don't blow it early, and try to save it mostly for running backs, especially if you are using it earlier.
Fab, free agent acquisition budget. I am curious if either of you use any sort of tool to determine how much to bid on a player. Does that just depend on your situation, the league situation? Or do you look at a percentage? Is there anything we should know in that regard, Sean?
It really depends on the situation. Sometimes I like to float a poll to see what other people and other leagues are thinking. I think the community aspect of that helps. Just get a sense, like, are people spending 30% of their budget on it? So just getting an idea of that helps. But again, it really depends on the situation. If there's somebody in your league that really needs a running back and they have 100% of their fab left, you just have to assume they're going to make a gigantic bid. Things like that. Knowing your league, if it's a bunch of friends, you should know your league. And then that would give you an edge of just like actually knowing the people. But again, it's one of those things that you just kind of have to guess. There's no like scientific way to do it, because all it takes is one person to outbid you. So it comes down to just how much are you willing to bid on the player. And then if you really like them, go a little bit higher. But again, I like to put out some polls on Twitter, or whatever it's called now, X. So just to get a rough sense of what other people are thinking outside of my thoughts.
Yeah, there's going to be no perfect way to determine it, because it's going to depend on the individual players available in your league, and as Sean mentioned, the kind of behavior, how aggressive or unaggressive are people. So a lot of times you could just kind of think of it as, if you think of it as a percentage for 17, it's roughly 6% per week, right? So if you kind of think, okay, how, again, you could go back to startable games. If you think this guy is going to start give you startable games for 8 games, then maybe you be willing to go up to somewhere near 50%. But again, it all depends on also how many guys, like how big is your league, how many guys are available, like is there more than like one like great game or player available per week on your waiver wire? Like all these things come in, so there's never going to be a exact number, but I would say start by just kind of dividing each week into like a 6% chunk, and then the more you're saving, the more flexibility you have to be a little wrong about how much you should spend. And it's more about, I think, the confidence level, and maybe like a max. So sometimes Sean and I will write up waivers and we might give a percentage like that, like that's the max I would spend on him. Now if you can get it, it's just like ADP. If your league is not that aggressive, you probably go a little lower, but you don't want to overspend to the point where you have literally zero flexibility in the last few weeks, where it could be the most important few weeks. So I'd say you could start by just kind of dividing it up into percentages and then kind of go from there, and just kind of like, if you're following like experts, look at how confident they are, what they're saying about the player, or if they give a percentage, or, you can kind of go off that. But there's no, it's more of a art than a science.
Yep.
Any other parting words, Sean, before we go?
Just again, draft as many running backs as humanly possible in the last rounds. I mean, we have been sitting here for 2 months with nothing going on since the draft, and everybody thought that everything was going to happen as expected. And look, 1 week in a training camp, we have Josh Jacobs out of town. Jonathan Taylor might be on the NFI list or whatever. Dalvin Cook might sign with the Jets. Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet are all hurt. Like, the running back position is a shit show, so you have to act accordingly.
Don't forget the great Sony Michel has hung up the cleats.
Yeah,
well.
he retired. Yeah, I mean, it's just a nightmare, and people always they're always confused. Like, wow, no, it's always going to be like this. It's going to get worse too. So make sure you have a lot stashed in your bunker.
I love it. Well, listen, this has been our experts' guide to fantasy football. Can't say thank you enough to our experts, Chris Raybon and Sean Kerner. For more fantasy football content from these two, be sure to follow them in our free award-winning Action app. You can also subscribe to the Fantasy Flex podcast right here at Action Network. Multiple episodes are released each week for both season-long and DFS players. And if you haven't already, be sure to check out the rest of our recently released episodes, our experts guides to sports betting series. We did NFL already, MLB, NHL, and more, all available now on the Action Network podcast presented by FanDuel. I'm Maria Marino. Thanks again.